And welcome to all of you, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online as well. Thank you for taking time to be with us, despite the fact that grand old days may or may not be blocking your direct path to the church, quite unintentionally, mind you. So thank you for being here this morning. We are on part 2 of our Celtic Christianity Then and Now. And the Reverend Ernie Ashcroft will, as we've just been discussing, give us a little recap of what we talked about last session, and then pick up the path and keep going into the present with Celtic spirituality where it meets us today. I'll open us in prayer, and then I'll shut up because Ernie has lots of good things to say. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Holy God, you call us in each generation and in each place toward and with your Son, into a world in need of both good news and healing. We give you thanks for our forebears in faith in the Celtic Christian world, who have made known to us new possibilities and new ways of seeing the divine. We give you thanks for the Reverend Ernie Ashcroft and his wisdom, and for each person here willing to learn and to grow more and more into the knowledge and love of you. Bless this time and our learning, all for the sake of your love. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Ernie,
Thank
please.
you. Now, first things first, the most important things. I brought my own coffee today. It's really good, and you're welcome to try it. If you want to try it, it's the left-hand side pot. And what you can do is you can take a little bit of that and a little bit of the church coffee and compare them. Roger did that. Secondly, I brought more of this I Love Mulled cheddar that I brought last week. Some of you, I think, didn't actually get any. On the blue plate, it's gluten-free. It's a gluten-free wafer. On the white plate, it's a non-gluten-free wafer. Now, I want to do a quick recap from last week, just in case, A, some of you weren't here, and B, some of you have forgotten. So what I started off by saying last week was that this term, Celtic Christianity, has had different meanings and different content at different times in the history of the church. But that is the only challenge that faces us about Celtic Christianity. What you'll notice if you do any Googling on this is that sometimes people speak about the Celtic Church, as if it were an organized denomination, uniting Celtic peoples from, Ireland and Scotland, and separating them from the Roman Church of continental Europe. When people speak about the Celtic Church like that, it's almost like they're saying, well, it was just a different denomination. Just like we have denominations today, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, and so on. But, it wasn't that way at all with the Celts. There were distinctively different traditions among Irish and British churches, and even within the British churches or the Irish churches, there was all sorts of local variations. And whatever they might have said during the Reformation, Christians in Ireland and Britain were decidedly not anti-Roman. They recognized the authority of Rome. There were areas of conflict between Celtic Christians and Roman Christians, but they were, to our mind, relatively trivial today. For example, how do you calculate the dates of Easter? They had different ways of doing it, which not surprisingly led to differences. What one group would say, this Sunday is Easter, and the other one would say, no, we're still in Lent. And so there were problems. And then even more trivial, the shape of the tonsure, the ball thing that the monks wore. Apparently, it was a big deal what the shape was, and people varied. And then, if people were wanting to come to terms with their sins, how did they express their penitence? What liturgy or what did they do with that? And it was different for the different churches. And then lastly, the Celtic Christians had a term that they called exile for Christ. And what they really meant by that was permanently leaving the place where the island where they raised them, so where they'd been raised, traveling elsewhere, putting themselves in God's hands, and permanently staying away from their homeland. Then Christianity actually probably reached Britain by the 3rd century. We know that St. Alban and Aaron and Julius were martyred in the 3rd century. There's some evidence, however, that Christianity arrived a bit earlier, maybe even as early as the 1st century during the reign of Tiberius. But now let's jump to Columba, because it's Columba who's most associated with Iona. Columba was a 6th century person. He arrived in 563 in Scotland together with 12 companions. And he went to the island of Iona, and there he set up what we know as the monastery on Iona. He was a very, very energetic missionary. And in addition to starting various churches in the Hebrides, he turned the monastery of Iona into a real sort of school for missionaries. It really developed, Iona really developed as a very influential center for the spread of Christianity among the tribes of Scotland, the Picts and the Scots. Later on, in what we call today the Dark Ages, that's when, you know, people like the Vikings and all the other sort of northern tribes who had little interest in learning and much interest in killing people. In the Dark Ages, it was the abbeys and monasteries of Scotland and Ireland which saved all the wonderful ancient Christian treaties, and also non-Christian philosophical and important texts from Greece and Rome. If that hadn't happened, the potential loss of all this ancient wisdom, intellectual and spiritual knowledge, would have been really catastrophic for the Western world. All right, I think that's enough about the sort of history. I want to talk today about the modern situation of Iona with the community that they have. And also we're going to talk a bit about pilgrimage. Iona is one of the oldest Christian religious centers in the whole of Western Europe. The Abbey was a focal point for the spread of Christianity throughout Scotland, beginning with Columba in the 6th century. By the 12th century, the local lords, who were called the MacDonald lords, they made Iona the ecclesiastical capital for the royal family of MacDonald. And subsequently, the lords of the Isles saw that as their sort of religious, almost like as if it were their sort of religious center. Exactly. However, in the early 16th century, following the Scottish Reformation, Iona, along with numerous other abbeys and monasteries throughout the British Isles, was dismantled, ruined, abandoned. Its monks and libraries were dispersed, or in some cases destroyed. And Iona remained a ruin for more than 4 centuries. The modern Iona community was actually founded in 1938 by a man called George MacLeod. He took to Iona a group of men. It was men, of course, in those days, only men, ministers and working men. And together they actually worked and they rebuilt the ruined Iona Abbey. And then MacLeod established an ecumenical community based on the island. Today, in the 21st century, the modern Iona community is actually a dispersed community. In other words, not everybody who's part of the Iona community actually lives on Iona. In fact, most of them don't. They have large numbers of members who work and live throughout the world. Now, there are a few members who live semi-permanently on the island. Today, there are 270 full members of the Iona community. Then there's another 1,800 associate members and 1,600 what are called friends of the community. The community has developed a very strong commitment to ecumenism, peace and justice issues, and care for the environment. Today, the Iona community actually runs 3 residential centers. There's the Iona Abbey and the MacLeod Center, both of which are on the island of Iona. And then there's a place on the island of Mull called Tamastrua. Folks who come to Iona are intended to treat it as a pilgrimage. They're encouraged, for example, to walk around the island of Iona. Iona is not a large island. You can walk around it quite easily in a day. And people are encouraged as part of their experience of Iona to, in a solitary way, on their own, to go and walk around the island and specifically to meditate while they're doing that on what discipleship means for them at this particular time in their lives. Ruth Harvey is the leader of the current leader of the Iona community. And she once said this. She said, people come here not for a hotel or a conference center. People come here for reflection and inspiration, and to explore issues of importance: the environment, poverty, migration, equality, all in the context of a Christian community in a beautiful, rugged landscape. In addition to pilgrimage, worship is absolutely central to the experience of visiting Iona. There are wonderful opportunities to worship in the Abbey, together with members of the Iona community. A group called the Wild Goose Resource Group, they're based in Glasgow, they've developed a large number of experimental worship resources, both prayers and songs, which are used in the Abbey. These worship resources, they're relevant, they're contextual, and they're participatory. Now, in addition to stuff in the worship in the Abbey, those who have accommodations at the bishop's house are expected to share in the daily worship services which happen in the bishop's house. There's a chapel actually in the bishop's house, and they do 2 services, one Eucharist and one non-Eucharist every day. In this peaceful and scenic place, it makes it easy for folks who come to set aside all the distractions and the bustle and the stresses of everyday life, and to reflect in a much more sort of intentional way on what Christian discipleship really involves for us. Well, that's a little bit about the modern Iona community. Now I want to talk a little bit about Christian pilgrimage. Christian pilgrimages were first made in the early part of the year, the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And people went to sites connected with the birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, they went to the Holy Land. The church father Origen himself made a pilgrimage in the 3rd century to the Holy Land. And from about the 4th century on, believers were encouraged, very much encouraged, by the church fathers and actually by Helena, who was the mother of Constantine, to themselves go on pilgrimages. Often, in medieval times, folks went on a pilgrimage as a sort of act of penitence for their sins. They often traveled great distances. And in those days, traveling great distances involved both hardships and danger. This experience for those medieval Christians caused them, while they were on a pilgrimage, not only to come to terms with their sins, but also to reflect on their own mortality. After all, I mean, if you're on a pilgrimage, and any minute a bunch of brigands might come up and lop off your head, it's easy then to focus on your mortality. Now, in our times, going on a pilgrimage no longer involves us in great hardship or dangers.
You did say that that bus route was a single lane road.
But when we go on a pilgrimage, it also involves us in a certain amount of sacrifice. We sacrifice, for example, to go on a pilgrimage, some of our money. It costs money to do that. But even more pressing, I think, it means that we have to sacrifice some of our precious time. Time, in some ways, for modern people, is even more important to us than money. And often, when people go on a pilgrimage today, it's not so much to reflect and be penitent about sins. It may involve that, but there's more to it than that. The overall purpose of a modern day pilgrimage is not simply to visit a place to admire its treasures or art or nature or history. It's not even primarily to reflect and remember those who've gone before us. It's certainly not the idea of some sort of a Christian vacation. To go on a pilgrimage today causes us to, as it were, step out of ourselves, step out of our regular lives, and actively seek a deeper encounter with God. That's the real purpose of a modern day pilgrimage. It's people who are saying, I'm going to set aside this time, I'm going to give up some of my money, and I'm going to really focus on what is it that God is wanting me to recognize and know at this point in my life. Where you go on a pilgrimage is usually a place where God's grace has been experienced with a particular intensity for people, leading to rich blessings to them, clarity of discernment, and a deeper sense of the presence of God in their lives. So whether you go to Iona or whether you go to another place of pilgrimage, the place that you go to fits those criteria that I've just been talking about. Now, those early Celtic Christians, to go back to them for a moment, they identified Iona as what they called a thin place. They really believed that in these thin places, and there were many thin places for them, they believed that the veil between this world and heaven was thin. It was almost non-existent. You know, there's a Celtic saying which has come down to us that heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in thin places, it's even smaller. So a thin place is a holy or a sacred space where we can expect more easily to encounter God. Many contemporary folks have had the experience of encountering God in a deeper way while on an Iona pilgrimage. But I do need to say that if you're going to go on a pilgrimage, preparation before embarking upon a pilgrimage to Iona or any other pilgrim site is absolutely critical. If we don't do the preparation before we go, it's less likely that we'll really engage in a deeper way. We prepare ourselves in advance, principally by prayer and reflection. And I can't emphasize enough how important that step is. You know, rather than sort of, you know, the day comes, oh, it's time to go to Iona, and then off you go, and you haven't done any preparation. You know, you're setting yourself up for it to be something of a disappointment to you. When we do engage in preparation, in prayer and reflection, it's a bit like we're tilling the soil of our souls. It's rather like the actions of a farmer in agriculture. You know, prior to planting his crop or her crop, the farmer invests time in preparing the fields to receive the seeds. Those of us who are preparing to travel to Iona next year would really do well to invest some time before the trip in what I call prayer and reflection, asking ourselves, what do we most of all want to experience as a result of doing this pilgrimage to Iona? Let me give you finish with a personal sort of story. In 2013, I spent 2 weeks on Iona on my own. I wasn't with a group. It was just me. I didn't stay at the bishop's house. I stayed, there's a hotel called the Columba Hotel, and I stayed there. Why did I go to Iona for 2 weeks? Well, I was on sabbatical, and I knew that in a little more than 2 years from that time, I would be 70, and then I would be retiring from parish ministry. So the question that was uppermost in my mind when I went to Iona is, God, when I retire, what's the next step for me? So over those 2 weeks on Iona, it really became clear to me that what I needed to do was I needed to become a spiritual director. Let me just explain that I'd been seeing a wonderful spiritual director, a Roman Catholic nun called Elizabeth, at that stage for about 15 or more years. And for me, doing spiritual direction had been absolutely transformative for my faith. You know, I was raised in a Christian tradition that was, Jared will recognize this, was pretty heavily sort of, it was Anglican, but it was pretty heavily on the sort of Protestant side. You know, it was important to read scripture. It was important to pray. But there were lots of things that you didn't take very seriously. You know, early on, when I went to see Elizabeth, in fact, at the end of our first session, she said to me, she said, now, what exactly do you want to get out of spiritual direction? And I thought for a minute or two, and I said, Elizabeth, you know, I am really good at telling God what I want God to do for me. And when God does what I want God to do for me, I'm really good at saying thank you. But I said, I'm really not very good about listening to God. And she got a big smile on her face and said, I can help you with that. And so for all those years, she really helped me with that. And it really broadened in a wonderful way my whole experience of walking with God. So it became clear to me when I was on Iona that I needed to become a spiritual director. So I had 2 years before I retired to obtain all the training necessary to be qualified as a spiritual director. And so since retirement, that's what I've been doing in all sorts of ways, offering spiritual direction to people. Now, next year, when we go to Iona, I will be turning 80, not 70, but 80. So when I go to Iona next year, I'll be discerning, God, what's the next step for me now? All right, that's enough for me. Why don't we let you ask any questions that you might have, or anything that you haven't understood, or anything that you've disagreed with. So we need somebody who's a real sort of extrovert to start us going.
Well, I just wanted to comment that pilgrimage in the United States is a bit of a foreign concept. We don't really talk about it, but I accompanied my son and daughter-in-law on a pilgrimage from Erfurt in Germany to Rome in 2010. And in Italy, we walked down the street and, you know, 7, 8-year-old kids would run up to us and say, are you pellegrini? Are you pilgrims?
Yes.
So it's just that society, it's an expectation that there are going to be pilgrims.
Yeah.
And the trails are marked all over Europe for pilgrimage routes, particularly Santiago.
Yep. Yep.
It's a scallop shell, and there's all different ways it's constructed.
Yeah.
But it's very clear that pilgrimage is a current reality, not a historical fact.
Yeah.
To piggyback on Roger's comment, many of you may have noticed when we do baptisms at St. John's that we give each baptizand the shell that is used to pour water over their head. It's not uncommon in Episcopal and Catholic parishes to use an ornamental shell, silver usually, so those are not given away. We've had ours turned into pewter or clay shells that look almost like real shells, and folks are baptized in a shell. If you stood near the font, you know that it is a shell. And that one of the reasons we do that is that it has long been believed in the Christian tradition that when you are baptized, you're not only becoming a part of the body and all these other metaphors, that you are beginning a pilgrimage of faith from God and toward God. So we give people that shell to carry with them as a symbol of their pilgrimage, and ask, put your coins, your rings, put your loose change in there, but keep it visible so that you can see it regularly, that we are all pilgrims, each of us.
And one other thing I want to say about pilgrimage is that sometimes in this country, pilgrimage is used for people who are going on some sort of trip in order to do some sort of Christian service. Now, I think it's wonderful to go on a trip and do Christian service, you know, to build something or whatever it might be. But that ain't a pilgrimage. Go on.
You know, Martin Sheen did a film called The Way about the pilgrimage. And so if you want to see a movie treatment of how pilgrimage was, that was on the Conference Sale.
Yes.
And he was there to retrieve his son's ashes, who had planned to take that trip, and he decided to
Yeah.
bring his son and work through that relationship. So it's a very
Great.
moving and
And it's called The Way,
yes,
and it's Martin Sheen.
Martin Sheen.
Thank you. Yes.
Mary in the back.
In 1981 or 82, I made a pilgrimage and a retreat to a Benedictine monastery in northeastern South Dakota. In the middle of nowhere. Well, that's kind of South Dakota. I was preparing to enter clinical training as a pastoral educator in the hospital. And I went on this pilgrimage. What you said, Ernie, kind of reminded me of, was I ready to listen, or was I wanting God to listen to my plans?
Right.
So I just want to comment, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was hard. It was hard to make the journey. It was hard to be quiet. It was spiritual work like I've never had to do. So I just want to highlight that this is not easy work.
Well, let me add to that, for those of you who are going to Iona, it's really hard work to get there. No, seriously. What you do, the easiest way of going is to fly from here to Glasgow in Scotland, which is about an 8-hour flight, right? When you get off the plane, you then get onto a train for about 3 hours, which takes you to a place called Oban, which is on the west coast of Scotland. When you get to Oban, you then climb on a bus. No, sorry, you climb on a ferry that takes you across. It takes about an hour to go from Oban to the Isle of Mull. When you get to Mull, Mull is quite a big island. When you get to Mull, you get on a bus, right? This bus takes you across Mull on a little road, which is it's a single road with passing places every so often, and lots and lots and lots of cows with no fences. So you travel for about an hour across Mull, and then when you get to the far side of Mull, you then hop on another ferry. This is a mere 10 minutes or 15-minute ferry, which actually takes you to Iona. When you get to Iona, you'll discover that vehicles aren't allowed on the island. And it's about, from where the ferry lands to where the bishop's house is, it's about almost half a mile. So then you walk. Now, sometimes they have a vehicle to take your luggage, sometimes they don't, but you walk from the ferry terminal, beautiful, to the bishop's house. So it's quite a performance to actually get there. Now, the good news is when we go, we won't be doing that all in one day. Otherwise, I suspect I'd have a number of heart attacks on my hands. What happens is you're on your own to fly from here to Glasgow, and then to get from Glasgow on the train to Oban. We'll meet in Oban on the Friday evening, and we'll meet for dinner, which I will have organized, in a local restaurant. And then we'll spend the night in a hotel in Oban, and then the next day do the rest of the travel to Iona. We get to Iona on the Saturday.
Ernie, I wanted to go back
all the way in time to the beginning, well, the recap today, but also your first presentation. And you were opening salvo that one of the big differences between Celtic spirituality as we have seen it now
Yeah,
and the Roman understanding of Christianity was one of the big ones was Easter or the calendar.
yes,
And then bring that forward to the idea of pilgrimage, because I find that while it may seem trivial, there's
Yeah.
also great profundity in that difference.
Yeah.
For generations, Christianity has wrestled with local or indigenous culture and how we see time, how we conceive of the self, these very basic concepts.
Yeah.
And then tried to reorganize them in ways that are quote Christian, but are often Roman or some other
or even pagan.
or even pagan.
Yeah.
And that certainly played out in Celtic Christianity, that there
Yeah.
was this wrestling between
Yeah.
an indigenous spirituality that had not yet encountered Christianity and a Roman understanding. And I think on pilgrimage, I've never actually been on a pilgrimage, but I hike regularly and go into other time
Yeah,
where time is governed by meal, water breaks,
yeah,
the sun and the moon,
yeah,
and these more organic timelines that don't fit our calendars, our phones, our business and capitalist ideas of time. And I think that when you go on pilgrimage, I'm assuming that's a similar thing, that time shifts
it does.
into a different rhythm.
Yeah, it
And
really does.
and I wonder if that's an aspect of Celtic Christianity that we could pay attention to while we're there. Is what was the dialogue back and forth between a conquering idea of time and a latent idea of time, and how those two
Right.
play out as we listen to the tides or the sun and the moon.
Well, it's interesting that you raise that, because that's, in a sense, a relatively small piece of when Christianity came to the Celtic folks. It wasn't just time, it was time, but it was also the fact that the Celtic peoples had a tremendous respect for the land. I mean, they really saw the land, the early Celts, the pagan Celts, if you like, they really saw the land as being something which was, they might not have used the term sacred, but that was the content of what they really felt about it. And so when Columba and co. all showed up, they very wisely didn't want to sort of reject those sorts of ideas, but they incorporated them into a Christianized form. So even today, as I was saying earlier on, the Iona community has a tremendous respect for creation, caring for creation, seeing creation as that which God has made, and therefore it needs to be cared for, looked after, respected, all those sorts of things. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
I think that's one of the reasons why I love the change of seasons, and really am at odds when I'm out. For instance, the one time we spent Christmas in Miami. But the wonder of the earth is just amazing, and maybe we can just all together remember that and lift that up as part of our preparation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there was somebody, yes.
What you described is that Iona is a remote, isolated place, open for travel by sea, certainly,
Yes,
but remote from land.
it is. Yes.
It's mystery to me why Colombo would choose a site like that. Was he expecting travelers from the sea?
No, I think there were two reasons. Remember, Columba came from Ireland. So traveling from Ireland towards Scotland, he was traveling east, right? And the island of Iona is one of the most extreme Western Islands of Scotland. So it would be one of the first places that he would actually make landfall, coming from Ireland. Secondly, his kinsman, and I've forgotten his name now, his kinsman actually, I don't know whether you would say owned the island, but certainly had control of the island. And he offered to Columba the opportunity to establish a monastery on Iona. So those two things together, you know, it was the first place, or one of the first places that they came to. Secondly, oh, I can actually be here and nobody's gonna throw me off the land.
Was it also a thin space that he had encountered as well, that there was this draw to be in a holy or thin space?
I don't know whether he'd experienced Iona as a thin place. Well, I don't think he could have experienced it before he arrived.
Right.
I think that when he got there, I think you're probably right, he then did experience it. But remember, once they got there and they'd actually sort of invested all the time and energy into building an abbey, it would have been difficult to say, oh, let's move on and start again.
That's right.
You know, I think maybe one more question. Yes.
Looks like it might be at least a 10-mile walk around the perimeter of the island. Does that sound?
It's certainly 8 miles. And you know, you don't need to do it all in one fell swoop. You can sort of say to yourself, you know, I'll do 3 or 4 miles today, and then the next day I'll go the opposite direction and do 3 or 4 miles again. Now, as we finish, I do need to eat some more cheese. Otherwise I'll have to take it home. And my dog likes cheese, but cheese isn't good for my dog. So please eat some more. As I say, the stuff on the blue plate is gluten-free wafers. Stuff on the white plate is non-gluten-free. So please do help yourselves. And I hope that this has been a helpful and even perhaps an illuminating time for you.
Thank you.
Good.